you're muted. Yeah.
Yep. I just put some thoughts together, but I've been putting them together since October. And, it's really great to see Larry and Fred, because we go back a long ways, but also Marcus Schwaninger, who I have not seen in a while, but and I'll mention in a minute, but it's just really great to see you. And say hi to Katerina.
Thank you. Pleasure is mine.
Yeah, I don't have the same history that Larry and Fred have, although I've heard so much about, learned so much about Klaus through them initially. But in terms of what I would like to share with you, can you see me okay? Is that okay?
No, you jump to the end. Come back.
I don't want to do that. Okay, so how do all I did is move a paper. There it is. Okay, so let's get this back in. Okay, so that's all I really need to have up there. So I first met Klaus, I think in the late 70s, early 80s, which is when I met Larry and Fred. But then where it really came together in terms of a personal connection with him was at the St. Gallen Conference in 1987. And what I remember about that were three things. One is that I had an extended set of conversations with Larry Richards in different rooms that we had in the hotel there and wandering around St. Gallen. That was really influential. I met Marcus and we did some things together, and that became very influential, and I spent other time. But I also had a lunch with Klaus and one other person, and we spent maybe an hour and a half, and we talked about cybernetics, and we talked about Germanic history, and we talked about St. Gallen and the architecture, where I fell in love with European architecture, especially Alpine. I spent a lot of time since then in Salzburg and other places as a result. But Klaus, what I remember thinking about Klaus at the time, and then over the years, was that he was sort of a transitional figure in the field. He wasn't at the same level generation as Larry and Fred and myself and others, but he wasn't as old as Heinz and Kenneth Boulding, who were on my dissertation committees, and the others who were sort of founders of the field. And what impressed me the most at the beginning and at the end was that of how he came to be what I would call embodied cybernetics. It was the way he interacted with people that grabbed me first, not what he was saying, which was second. And you said it's a sad time, Jason, when you open this, but I don't feel sad at all. I think this is a celebration. I think if I could make it to 90 and participate in a conference from the hospital bed and not have anybody have any clue how serious it was going to be, how quickly, boy, that'd be a way to go out. I mean, that is just a rich and fulfilling life in all kinds of ways. So what I did is I took a look at, and I had been engaging with more of Klaus's work in a direct way in the last 4 or 5 years after I retired from San Jose State and recovered from a major health issues. And I was starting to focus on this new project I'm doing on Homo cyberneticus and how human cyberneticity has created the Anthropocene. And I was particularly interested in issues of agency and autonomy and how we do that in interactive ways, but not only the science, but the history of it, how it has manifested itself and had such a dramatic jump in the last 500 years that now creates this new world, both in terms of planet issues and people issues. So the key points that affected me. So this is a very subjective, personal, there's no way I would claim that these are Klaus's best contributions. I don't have the wherewithal to be able to assess what's his best contributions. I know he was really highly regarded in the communications field for his work on content analysis and other things, but I knew him as a cybernetician. And what I found particularly useful, and I put it into just sort of 2 categories after going through some pieces of work of the key points that have had an impact on me in terms of the work that I'm doing. And some of it was because of just Klaus was having something to say in a field that were on topics that were directly relevant to my interests, so I would pay a lot of attention. But I could also make points on other topics that weren't quite as central, but fall under the category of cybernetics that I found really important. And I would listen because I just wanted to hear what he had to say. And when I say listen, I'm thinking along the lines of what Larry was saying of both thinking individually and thinking collectively and engaging in it. Sometimes you sit there, I do, certainly on bandwidth issues, and I'll listen to what's going on, but I'm not deeply engaged. With Klaus, I was always deeply engaged. I would be really thinking and looking at it. So the points that I think, most of these points I agree with. There are a couple where I do not. I disagree with Klaus on. But the ones that had an impact on me falling under sort of critical cybernetics. First, his focus on reflexivity, and in particular advocating a shift from cognitive observers, which is what has characterized much of what is called second order cybernetics, but more of an emphasis on participatory designers. In a couple of papers, he makes a really key point that it's not just about being able to understand how to interact with other systems. You get a very different perspective when you actually have to design and build and as a participant in creating them, because that kind of knowledge is not the same as just what it takes to interact with. I also liked his critical approach to the nature of information. And he in particular, he in one or two of his papers, he referenced Gregory Bateson's distinction about what I would call information reflects objective differences. And he says he'd like to change that. And I liked his change better, which is that information is not just out there. It's not a substance. It's not just an entity unto itself. It's not an ontological phenomenon. It's constructed distinctions. And so in essence, information is not just a difference that makes a difference, but it's constructed distinctions in one domain that are communicated to another domain and make a difference over there. And again, he had a way of talking about information, which is a critical notion in not only in cybernetics and the history of it and current operations, but throughout all of what's going on in society. I mean, this new position I have in Australia, there's a huge emphasis on the interface between human beings and artificial intelligence, and information is a connecting concept there. You know, Klaus's distinction about the nature of information I find more helpful and builds nicely on what Bateson did originally. I think he also was very pointed and very insightful about the unintended consequences of runaway algorithms and human agency, and letting the technological world influence and inhibit, you know, human agency without us fully appreciating the fact that we're the ones creating it, and that you can't just attribute metaphorically, you know, capabilities for agency and autonomy to technologies, because they're very different kinds of phenomena in the human world than they are in the technological world. The other point is that his notion of critical cybernetics, and actually it's evident in several of his publications, but what I found particularly helpful, Jason, was a session that he did on critical cybernetics for the Club of Remy. And then I asked him afterwards to get a copy of his slides, and he sent them to me. And as I was looking through them in the last couple of days, you know, fine tuning what I was going to say here, I was just struck by how insightful and clear he was on some key points that, frankly, when he made them, I didn't grasp them or appreciate them as much. But it's because I've been doing research on my project, and now I'm seeing how this directly affects my thinking and my perspectives, both from a scientific standpoint and also an historical standpoint, when you look at the evolution of human history and how it has evolved, especially in the last 500 years or so. So those are broad points. The ones on social cybernetics that I found, and then I've lumped them. And again, it's a clustering and organizing way of doing it, because we could have talked for a long time. I mean, these are key points. This is constraining it so that I would, like some of our discussions, Larry, over the year about constraint theory and looking at goals as constraints has been helpful in ways that I never thought about it before. But when you organize a presentation, it's mostly about making sure I constrain myself, that I don't go wandering off in all these different musings. But points that are particularly relevant to the work I'm doing now. His emphasis and interest in agency and autonomy, and clarifying and underscoring multiple ways, multiple times, that these are human capabilities, not technological traits. And while we may be, and I don't remember him addressing it quite as explicitly as I've been doing in some of my other work, but we may be designing technologies that may have some of these capabilities, but they're still fundamentally human capabilities, and it's not just transferable over there. And to draw attention to the fact, especially in folks who are particularly interested in technological concerns, as you know, I soaked up when my 40 years in Silicon Valley, he was pretty consistent about that. He also made the point that social systems were not agents. He emphasized the notion of networks of conversation among agents. He emphasized the importance of conversations because of interest in languaging and the importance of language. I never really paid as much attention to the importance of language in terms of how society evolved, as much as it was just sort of a topic on its own. But he helped illuminate that and focus some of my attention on it. I disagree with him, and he and I had some conversations offline about, I do think that social systems can be agents in different ways. I don't think all social systems are agents, but there's certainly kinds of social systems that are able to engage and take actions at the group level, at the community level, at the national level, at the international level. But the discussions and his points with respect to agents, as both Larry and Fred indicated, gave me pause and forced me to think and go back and say, well, if I do disagree with him, I better have my thinking together if we're going to talk, because you know, you don't want to be embarrassed when you're talking with him. I mean, he's clearly really, really bright guy and a really, really thoughtful guy. And a lot of bright people aren't necessarily thoughtful. And I mean, not just thoughtful in thinking, but thoughtful in his interacting and the way he engaged people. And I saw him engage people, others engage me, engage other people. It's just amazing. I think also his emphasis on the clarity of, with respect to the unintended consequences of runaway conscious purpose, in particular drawing on and emphasizing what Bateson did at the Wenner-Gren conference. I had remembered reading Mary Catherine Bateson's Our Own Metaphor years ago, and then had done a lot of work with her at the Salzburg Global Seminar when I was leading the program there in global citizenship. And I knew that there had been something back there, but it was a comment that he made in one of our Remy sessions, Jason, actually. And I said, can you send me the reference on that? And he referred as an offside comment about Bateson's concern about conscious purpose. And again, the runaway consequences, and I would argue not just ecologically, but in terms of the human domain as well. Anytime you go from a billion people to 8 billion people in less than 200 years, and that combination of population and prosperity is what's driven the Anthropocene. If we had half the number of people, we wouldn't be in the conditions we were. If we weren't as prosperous, we wouldn't be in the conditions. But Bateson was certainly a pioneer in thinking about these runaway consequences, unintended consequences. But Klaus underscored it and enriched certainly my understanding. And finally, his key point that I would close with is this: the importance of human agency and the fundamental role that it plays in social systems and how we interact. Again, going back to his focus on participatory understandings and perspectives to cybernetics, not just individual cognitive or biological perspectives. And that agency is how we engage and manifest participation. And that given its fundamental role, there's a need for, he calls it accountability. I've always talked about autonomy and responsibility. But when we engage with others, we have two dimensions to that as far as I'm concerned. One is the accountability for what we do. I'm an agent. I did it. It wasn't done mysteriously over there. I always find it more helpful to speak in the first person when it's appropriate than the third person. Even finally getting my university to agree with the fact that people doing theses and dissertations didn't have to write in the third person all the time. I said, you just can't do that. They did the work. Let's hear it from them. But Heinz was particularly good on this. But it's not just accountability individually. It's the responsibility to the greater good. Part of we engage and create social systems, sometimes consciously, sometimes we're born into it, in essence, because increased autonomy enables us to express and engage our capabilities and extend our capabilities as agents. But the benefits that come from interacting with other people also means that we have to compromise our own autonomy. The only way to have complete autonomy, the freedom to act as people, individuals feel like they're doing, is if there's nobody else or no other factors that are constraining their autonomy. That as soon as we start having interactions among autonomous agents in a back in a substrate in this particular place, the spaceship Earth, then there are going to be compromises. And the value that lies in the giving up some of your autonomy, not all of it, but compromising some of that or constraining some of that autonomy, is that you have increased benefits from collective agency. And so therefore, to me, human agency includes not only a bit the response, the focus on accountability, individual accountability, or systemic accountability for whoever's engaging and manifesting the agency, but it's also responsibility to the greater good to look at the bigger picture. And of course, central to anthropologists and central to cyberneticians and systems people is the fundamental importance of context. And as Bateson said, you're never just looking at the system, you're looking at the system and its environment. And I would take it further and say you're never really just looking at the system, but you're looking internally to the parts and the relationships and the interactions. And when you look at the environment, that's the immediate context for what the system's doing, but there's all the background context that goes ultimately to the universe as a whole. So I just found Klaus's insights very thought-provoking and very engaging. And that but what really turbocharged it was because the way he interacted is he manifested the cybernetics that he was advocating. And he did it in ways that were clearly conscious, sometimes not conscious, sometimes even conspiratorially. And he would, I didn't know about Larry, but he would enlist other people to ask questions to get things going. So I just thought he was a really, I didn't know him as well as Larry and Fred and others, but I just thought he was a really special character and person within the cybernetics community, and which is why I appreciated the opportunity to have express some words. So that's enough for me for now. Thank you for the opportunity.
That's great. I agree with you. It is a celebration.
Yeah, Bill, I mentioned this during my presentation, but Klaus actually is very well known, far better known in the communication studies circles than he is in cybernetics, and a lot of his contributions are there. He invented something called the Krippendorff alpha. Right. I don't even know what it is, but I know, when you have something named after you and it's something that people recognize in your field, that's quite something.
Yeah, it's a way of getting at inter-rater reliability, which is so important because the idea that I can make a claim and you can make a claim, Larry, how do we actually have a way of saying that this is a claim that is shared by others rather than just one person's individual perspective? So it's used in a lot of anything where reliability is done, in observations, in ethnography, for example, Krippendorff's alpha gets used.
Well, and that was actually, it's an aside, but that was actually had an impact on my career at San Jose State. So I was at San Jose State for 40 years in Silicon Valley. At the time, I'd been hired into the Cybernetic Systems program, which was the first degree granting program in the world in that field. And then became director and was actively engaged. But we had a senior vice president for research and graduate studies who did not understand cybernetics. She had a husband who was a systems analyst and had been at the Pentagon. She had a very narrow view of what systems and cybernetics were about. And she was just a real hard ass on my case, on the program's case. And at the time that I was going up for tenure, and promotion to early, this was early tenure and early promotion, and she was really opposed to it. While I had a lot of others, she said, well, I need some outside references. And I said, well, and I knew, and she was in communication studies, Larry. So this, you triggered, this is an abductive trend here, but this is what, in terms of going through it, it had an impact. She said, do you have anybody? I said, well, yeah, so I listed Kenneth Boulding, and I listed Heinz von Forster, and I listed Klaus Krippendorff. She said, you know Klaus? And he had just been elected president, or he was a big, but I think just been elected president of the American Communication Association. And I said, yes. And she said, is it okay if I talk to him? I said, absolutely. Well, he obviously said some nice things, and supported professionally, personally, and everything else. And she said, okay, I won't oppose it. This is good enough for me. But it was not because he had any credibility as a cybernetician, or that she really believed in anything what we were doing in the cybernetic systems program. It's just that she said, if in her field, he was one of the royalty. And if he said it was okay, and he apparently did more than just say, yeah, he's a good guy, she wasn't going to go up against that. And it had an impact. I think I probably would have still done well at San Jose State otherwise, but to get early tenure and early promotion in a field that was controversial certainly made a huge boost in my career. So thanks for recalling that. I hadn't thought about that in years, Larry, but it was just, and Klaus did not know me well personally. This was not a personal recommendation. It was just based upon our interactions and some of the things I'd done. So he was, you never know when you throw a pebble, what kind of eddies, where it's going to go. And he had impact in a lot of places. So thanks.
Thank you.